The relationship is very clear. Fewer passengers means fewer flights, and fewer flights means fewer people required to actually service them. As CEO of British Airways, I have to take responsibility. I cannot ignore the situation. I had to act incredibly fast. And I deeply, deeply regret that way too many loyal and hardworking colleagues of mine are having to leave our business. And I understand why MPs are concerned. This is an impossible situation. We're having to make incredibly difficult decisions as a consequence of this pandemic. And it is really only because of COVID-19 that we have had to go through such deep restructuring. I only have to make these decisions, these difficult decisions at this time, but I am completely dedicated and focused on protecting those nearly 30,000 jobs of all of those British Airways colleagues that will remain within the business. So in summary, the worst crisis for BA, and still 6 months on, significant fewer passengers actually traveling on a daily basis throughout the British Airways network.
And what do you see in terms of optimism for the coming months? I mean, do you see good news on the horizon, or are you still very much concerned about the direction that government policy may have on your ability to get more people on those flights?
We remain worried with regards to the evolution of the rest of the winter season. We are encouraged by the potential decision to get slot relief throughout all European airports. But the fact remains that people are still afraid of traveling. And of course, we are having weekly changes, as you know, to the quarantine list. We don't have a testing solution yet, and we still are paying, our customers are paying APD even just to fly on domestic regional flights. So the overall situation is quite challenging, and this is why we are taking every measure possible to make sure that we can actually make it through this winter, and that we can join the recovery, hopefully, into the next few years in a way that we will be able to continue expanding our network and looking for ways to make it through all this negative impact. But once again, yes, we do not see a short-term coming back of our passengers. All the feedback that we get, all the data that we get, all the companies we speak with, all the consumer groups that we speak with are still pointing at a slow recovery process.
And perhaps you've touched on the difficulties in terms of business. You've also been through a restructuring with regards to your staff, as you touched on there. When we took evidence from Mr. Walsh, there were plans to have to make up to 12,000 redundancies. And then, as you touched on, the remaining 30,000 staff, our report highlighted concerns that they may have their terms and conditions changed if they were able to stay on. Do you have an update as to how those restructuring and negotiation plans are going with terms and conditions? And would you be able to share that with the committee?
Yes, absolutely. So we, as you know, started as soon as the COVID-19 began to spread and restrictions began to be applied across the world. We began to consult with our industry bodies, with our sister airlines, with the group, to try to come up with the best understanding of how deep this crisis could go. And it was really towards the middle of March that it became apparent to us that the impact of this pandemic was going to be the highest ever impact of any previous crisis that our sector had ever gone through. So therefore, in following the law, the Trade Union and Labor Relations Act, we filed in April the Section 188 and HR1 forms with the government and with the unions, outlining the maximum number that we thought would be of people that would be affected, of potential redundancies, as well as a large collection of topics that we wanted to enter into collective consultation with the unions. The reaction was different from the different unions. We had an immediate engagement with the pilots union, who were interested in looking at the financial details. We shared each and every one of our forecasts, of our cash positions, etc. And it really took them just hours to react. And we began to meet with them in very intense, very difficult, and yet very constructive and productive meetings, which ended up in an agreement a number of weeks afterwards with the pilots, which we are in the midst of implementing. Unfortunately, the other unions, the non-pilot unions, chose a different path and decided not to engage with us. We sent them over 500 pages of proposals, ideas, potential mitigations. We invited them to over 520 different meetings, which they did not attend. And it took 73 days before the trade union representatives were allowed to come and meet with us. And I'm pleased to tell you that since then, today is day 140 of this consultation process, which is still ongoing. But I'm pleased to report to you that since the non-pilot unions began to engage with us, we have been able to reach agreements, sign agreements. And I believe that as we speak right now, the remaining large areas within British Airways are currently being balloted as we have reached agreements in principle, which will mean that there will be no need whatsoever to issue new contracts. It will just be using the standard methodology of a union agreement, which makes some amendments to the existing contracts. And we hope that the majority of that process will finish this week.
Well, that sounds a positive update. So, what has been termed as fire and rehire seems to be off the table. And are you now following an approach perhaps similar to Ryanair and some of the other airlines, where staff are just taking a reduction in terms, perhaps below 20%, say, and then it may well be that those amounts can be won back if better times arrive?
I can't comment on what Ryanair has done. Ryanair is a completely different airline from ours. They just fly in Europe. We fly globally, very large airplanes, multiple classes, etc. But what I can tell you is that it was absolutely, as we communicated over and over and over and again to our staff, our intention from the very beginning to reach agreements. This was the right way to go about it. And the fact that we were able to sit down with the pilots union from the onset and reach an agreement within a few weeks, and it was, I frankly regret a lot that it took such a long time for the other unions to sit down, and I'm very pleased that even though we are on day 140, way nearly 100 days beyond the statutory 45 days, but we have reached these agreements in principle. I think that's what matters. That removes uncertainty and it provides a framework for us to face the next phase of this pandemic.
Understood. And again, we're going to go into the detail now, but I just want to make sure I'm setting for the other committee members the situation as you've just given it. So what's been termed as the fire and rehire is now off the table, and as a result, it's just a more sort of conventional reduction in pay, perhaps in return for that amount perhaps to be given back. I just want to be absolutely clear that that's the case, because obviously that's quite significant. It was that aspect that our committee report over the summer was quite critical of British Airways off. So that is a change of position, and a welcome one. And
Mr. Chairman, just to be match your wish to be absolutely exact, and to be fair both to my staff and to the trade unions, I understand, as we speak, we have reached agreements in principle with the majority of the areas, but some of those areas have already balloted and accepted those agreements, and some of those areas are in the process of balloting. So I think it would be fair to say that we very much hope that the results of those ballots will be to accept these agreements. That will end this process and will bring the certainty that I think we're all looking for.
Well, that's a very welcome news and a welcome development, and I hope that continues to be the case. We'll drill in a bit more detail. I do, however, want to give you the opportunity, because I think it was over the summer after our report was issued that you were critical of it, because you felt that it was not based on the facts but was based on rumour and emotion. And I just wanted to give you the opportunity to point out which parts of our report were not based on fact in your belief.
Well, I agree with many of the sections of the report, but there are statements in the report which are incorrect. For example, there was a suggestion that the consultation that we were involved in was going to finish on the 15th of June, and here we are on day 114. The consultation, very rightly so, continues. But I am here today to answer your questions in this committee in good faith and to tell you about this incredible crisis that BA is facing and how we at BA are responding to the impact that this pandemic is having on our business.
Okay, well that's absolutely fine. I wanted to make sure you had the chance to put that on the record. We could perhaps go back and forwards on what isn't and is a fact, but actually I think it's more encouraging that you're making a breakthrough for your staff. So let's be positive. Now let's start to go into detail, and I think we're going to first of all ask you a bit about the situation with regard to quarantine and the new air bridges or travel corridors, and I'm going to ask my colleague Lillian Greenwood to take us through this section.
Good morning, Mr. Cruz. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Great, sorry. So obviously there have been a number of changes in the approach to quarantine. We've moved away from the 14-day blanket ban for all locations, and it's gradually changed over the summer period. But there in recent weeks been differences in approach between the different nations across the UK. How does the government's current approach to quarantine affect your operations? And what level of communication have you had with the government prior to changes in the rules?
So I understand that the government is facing its own set of challenges dealing with the pandemic across all areas, and particularly in travel. The degree of contact that we have had with the government has been very active. I would say even more than weekly through different working groups, and I have been in contact with both ministers and Secretary of States at different points in time as different changes were being considered. At the end, and as I mentioned on the letter to the Prime Minister just a few days ago, there are different areas of work that are extremely urgent that we address. And as you mentioned, the quarantine policy is one of them. But before that, it is incredibly important that we reach a testing regime of some sort as quickly as possible so that we can reduce that quarantine time to the minimum possible. We are making a suggestion that we actually run a test between London and New York so that we can give authorities on both sides of the Atlantic an opportunity to test different ways in which a particular testing regime would actually work. This is imperative so that we can drive the confidence of travelers and we can get business going again. As you mentioned, I also believe that we have to continue working on the current scheme of quarantine. The daily, I would say weekly announcements of countries going in and out of the list is indeed incredibly disruptive. It's disruptive primarily for our passengers who are having to either make changes to the reservations at the last minute, or they feel that they have to come back at the very last minute as well. I should also say it's very disruptive to an airline such as ourselves across many different kinds of areas. If I were to choose one, I would say we are having to stand by new aircraft and new crews. We have a lot of volunteers that are trying to help out at those times. So definitely enhancing the current scheme to make it more consistent and deliver less change on an ongoing basis will provide more confidence on travel. The final point that I addressed to the Prime Minister on my letter was around APD. APD is a tax that we've spoken about for such a long time, and I don't want to go over all the main reasons why we believe it's wrong. But what is wrong today is that it's disabling regional travel. The fact that today more taxes are being paid on a return flight to Glasgow or Edinburgh or Aberdeen or Manchester versus a return flight to Rome or Paris, it's something that should not be accepted. We need to find ways to stimulate travel. And we know that if we were to get a waiver on APD for some years, I think it will make a huge difference in us being able to get travel back up and running. BA has acted quickly, decisively, as soon as we realized that this pandemic was going to have a huge impact on our business, on our workforce. We began to do things. And we really asked the government to begin to change quickly.
Thanks, Mr. Cruz. I'm sure my colleagues will pick up some of the issues around APD, and airlines' views on APD are well known. Just bringing you back to the two issues. On the criteria for inclusion in the quarantine, Is your main concern the fact that that on a weekly basis the government are reviewing which countries are included in quarantine, and isn't that just inevitable given the changes in infection rates both in different countries, or is it the fact that the criteria are not clear and consistently applied, as perhaps we saw with the issues around Portugal at the end of August, where Wales and Scotland introduced quarantine, but England didn't, even though it appeared to be over the limit that had been set. Is that the main issue, or are there other issues that you're more concerned about?
Well, first, we absolutely support all the measures that the government is taking to try to protect its citizens, of course. I think that what we're mostly concerned is with the output of the current regime. And yes, I appreciate the comments with regards to how the government has been evolving. And indeed, there was a blanket policy to start with. And as you know, we challenged it. And ultimately, we appreciate that more science and specific criteria, additional criteria was brought in to make decisions on the countries. Our main concern is the output of the current regime, and the output of that is extreme variance on the number of countries that are actually being taken in and out, and the lack of regional consideration beyond the recent regional considerations that were made just a couple of weeks. We need more regional considerations in order to be able to fly to places where the actual rates of infection and the other metrics are significantly lower than in the UK. So we need more detail, we need it really fast, and the output of that has to be a consistent list of countries with which we can do business with which we can get the economy running again.
And coming back to the issue of testing, I mean, you'll know that the government is exploring the ways in which testing might be used to reduce the duration of quarantine, although having seen the current state of the testing system in the UK, that's clearly some way off. Is your view that is the role that testing should play, that once people have returned to the country, they should be able to get a test at some point to reduce the level of their quarantine? Because having testing at airports isn't really going to solve it, is it, given the incubation period? What's your proposal for the pilot on New York that you described?
So certainly the first step of protection, we fully understand it a number of months ago when the blanket quarantines were applied. The ultimate solution, as you know, will be a vaccine when we all kind of go through it. What's in the middle has to be some sort of testing regime. There are multiple ideas being put forth by different our industry bodies. We have suggested this test on arrival plus another test 5 days later as a potential solution. But we are absolutely open to many other types of testing on departure, again, together with on arrival. We just want to make sure that it is understood that British Airways is there to support any trial of that, any such scheme as quickly as possible. We need to be able to reassure our authorities, and authorities not just here in the UK, but also authorities in the countries that we fly to. And we also need to reassure the government that all the precautions are being taken into place. So we have made some suggestions indeed. But the point for us in the industry is that we're sitting here, we're ready to go. We need some testing regime that will minimize the quarantine process. So again, we can get people traveling. With the current quarantine process of 2 weeks, unfortunately, we are not having sufficient travelers wanting to do either business or wanting to go on holiday.
Are you seeing your competitors doing better because they're than other countries that have got a different regime around testing, or is that impacting your ability to fly on to improve things on certain routes?
We are a global airline, and we fly to more than 100 countries around the world. And it is true that we are exposed to more than 100 different policies, you could almost argue. I think the UK is in a position in which it can go act faster, and it can do more things now that will benefit the British economy and British jobs. Our suggestion is to begin a trial on testing, either on arrival or on departure. Our suggestion has been on arrival and then 5 days after arrival around a particular corridor, London, New York. There's a tremendous amount of both business and leisure customers, so that we can have some data of reference that we can all use and that we can then replicate across other models. But yes, there are other governments, and I understand our own government is speaking with many other governments to understand the degree of success or failure that has existed in other schemes.
Thank you, Mr. Cruz. Back to you, Chairman.
Thank you very much, Lillian. So we'll now move, if we may, to the current financial situation British Airways finds itself in. We've touched on this at the start, Mr. Cruz, but we'll go into a little more detail, and I think I'll be asking my colleague Sam Tarry to lead us through this section.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning, Mr. Cruz. I just want to focus on some of the financial aspects of both BA and IAG. Clearly, this year's been extremely challenging for the wider group and for British Airways, as you've explained, and as this committee is very much familiar with. But one of the things we want to really kind of understand, and we've tried to be clear about, is the measures that were taken by BA, by the decisions by yourself and endorsed by Willie Walsh, and whether they were justified given the cash reserves of the organisation. So one of the things I want to kind of understand, and perhaps you could help answer this question, is that if the group is planning to strengthen its balance sheet by raising €2.75 billion of extra capital, could you just be really clear to this committee today what the current financial position is of BA and IAG, and perhaps, give an indication to us theoretically how long you could actually survive without those cash reserves? Because I think one of the things that people have found most egregious is that on our reckoning you are one of the most profitable airlines on the planet. IAG has gone about buying up other airlines during this pandemic, and yet the first thing you've done was to enact that fire and hire really tough set of cuts to staff. And obviously thousands of your staff, as you said, you regret, have already lost their jobs, and many more are still deciding their futures. But we want to be clear on that financial aspect, because it is true, isn't it, that you are in a very healthy financial position despite the pandemic.
Thank you. I think it would be inaccurate on my side to say that we are in a healthy position. I think that if you had looked at the situation that we ended the year last year, 2019, we could have asserted that precisely, but that's no longer the case. I think it's very important, and I will answer with specific numbers all the questions, but I think it's very important that we look at the impact of this pandemic, and I'd like to give you some very specific numbers that you can also use in your analysis. We've gone back and taken a look at the financial impact that British Airways went through in 9/11, the financial crisis. Let me choose the financial crisis, for example. It turns out that after the great financial crisis, 2007, 2008, and the first quarter of 2009, we lost £309 million. In the second quarter of this year, the first full quarter of the pandemic, you could argue at the beginning of the pandemic, we lost £711 million. But what's much worse than that, there were two outputs of the great financial crisis. One was that it took 4 years for global air traffic to recover back to the same levels from before the financial crisis. And the second impact, extremely relevant to British Airways, was that the percentage of business travelers traveling in premium classes never recovered, even last year, and at no point since the financial crisis. So when you look at our cash position or our profits, in a way, I'm thankful that we were able to deliver profits over the last 3 years in such a way that put us in a position and that gave us a little bit more resilience than many of our competitors around the world. But let me be specific and to your question. We ended up last year, British Airways, with £2.6 billion in cash, and at the end of June we had £2.1 billion in cash. We've been burning approximately an average of £20 million of cash per day, and during this whole time we've been trying to raise money. As you know, we've been able to use a couple of the facilities that the government has offered to industry, and we have been able to raise money against our aircraft, £600 million. And as you so mentioned, our group is in the middle of raising €2.75 billion. This is an ongoing process, and I hope that that money will help with the liquidity of the group. We'll be able to improve our financial leverage and give us a little bit more room to weather what we believe is going to be a long protruded recovery period of time.
Thank you, Mr. Cruz. One of the questions I've been trying to sort of dig in as we prepared for today was just looking at the situation of yourself in terms of your own financial remuneration. It's not necessarily clear from BA accounts exactly how much you do get remunerated. There are some aggregate enrolments worth 996,000 and pay in 2018 of 1.278 million. And I also am aware that you are part of the IAG long-term incentive scheme, which you obviously have share options in. So could you just clarify for the committee, because I think there will be a lot of people watching today who will be interested to see what measures you've personally taken during this difficult time, what your current salary is, including bonuses and share options, and whether your senior management team, who I understand were removed from the fire and hire scheme very early on in the process, whether they've actually taken any cuts to their pay during this crisis as well.
Okay, so the details are as follows. My salary, benefits and pension amounted in the year 2019 to £805,000. I did not receive a bonus. In fact, no one in my management team or in my company received a bonus for the year 2019. And you made reference to shares. Indeed, at the beginning of the year, I received the equivalent of 164,000 shares in relation to that performance plan of the year 2017, which are not available for the next 2 years. My management team, and in fact, all managers at British Airways have taken salary cuts throughout this process, which range between 5% from junior managers up to 20% to more senior managers. In my case, I have taken 33.3%, 1/3, 33% salary cut.
Last time we had Willie Walsh at the committee, he actually boasted he was taking a 20% pay cut, and he actually added, and I wrote it down, so I'm probably one of the first CEOs to volunteer a pay cut. And when the chair actually asked him if about that, he said, it's pay that's foregone and I'm not getting it back. So would you be able to explain to the committee how that can be squared with a bonus of over £800,000, I think it's 833,000 as part of a package worth over 3 million. And in fact, there were a significant number of shareholders who were in revolt about that at IAG, because that amount of money, when some of the staff at BA have obviously been offered, I think it was on average for some of them, in particular bargaining sectors, an equivalent of only £300 per month for each year worked, which is obviously pretty outrageous when the scale of that bonus is being paid to Mr. Walsh. Would you be prepared to comment on that?
Well, I cannot comment on the decision of either Mr. Walsh or the IAG board in terms of the compensation of their officers. What I can comment on is on the British Airways team. And the British Airways team has seen this pandemic from the very beginning as something that we needed to respond as quickly as possible. And hence, these salary cuts that I just told you about, and of course, no bonus for anybody again in 2019, and I don't expect that anybody will get a bonus this year or for many years to come, I would imagine. So that is what I'm prepared to offer to you, the experience the British Airways and its staff and its management has gone through.
Obviously, things are going to be tough in the transport industry for the next few years, and passenger demand would obviously need to increase for you to go back to similar levels of profitability. Would you be able to say to the committee today and to your staff that will no doubt be watching the committee this morning, whether if you are to go back into profit, that BA employees would actually see an improvement in their pay and their terms and conditions? Because although you've tried to say that fire and hire is off the table, isn't it true that that is only on the basis of the contracts being agreed, and actually all of those contracts now have to have a 22-week layoff clause, which is almost unprecedented, not far off of signing up to a 0 hours contract?
Okay, no, I believe I can provide you with more information, more precise information around these topics. Number one, there are no 22-week unpaid leave agreements in any of the agreements that we've reached with our staff. Number two, the majority of the agreements that we've reached with the unions make provisions for coming back and having discussions about the restoration of pay in the future, and there's specific methodologies and times when we will do that. It is the right thing to do, very much so. And overall, I guess I would emphasize that this is information that we have shared all along over all these 140 days through multiple communications, not just with the unions, but with our staff, and they have seen how these agreements have been coming to fruition. But again, those I reject that 0 hours comparison. I think that you're making reference to a layoff contract, that a layoff clause, which has been in many contracts at British Airways for many years now, and that has never been used in the past. And if you look at the specific language that has been included in these agreements in principle that we've reached and the agreements that we have closed with the unions, you will see that we specifically mention that they will be used as a measure of last resort, and that we will be getting together with them to look for other measures before we invoke those layoff clauses. So that is very far from a generic description of a 0 hours contract, I believe.
But so Sam, we'll come back to this point as well. So I think what we're hearing you saying is that this 22-week layoff clause doesn't exist. We will touch on where there may be some layoff clauses of, I think, 7 weeks, maybe with Gatwick staff. You've also very kindly helped us with regard, which is sort of breaking news for us and very welcome, that the fire and rehire proposal is now off the table and out to ballot, so we have to see what occurs. We are going to move on to the situation with regard to redundancies, pay, terms and conditions. Before I ask Gavin Newlands to start us off on that front, can you just perhaps give us a little more detail about what is actually being put out to ballot? It would be incredibly helpful, because obviously it stops us going over irrelevant ground if you've got more detail for us.
Thank you. I believe that there are 3 different ballots taking place or about to start taking place at the moment, based on 3 agreements in principle that we've reached with different workforces. Each one of them have slightly different provisions to them as negotiated with the unions. Perhaps I should choose one that in the past this committee has been, one particular working group that this committee has been more familiar with, and that's our cabin crew group. As you know, our original proposal was to bring together 3 different groups of people that were working in 3 different ways with different processes and procedures into a single one. We consulted on that very early on. We awaited for feedback. It took a long time, but we ultimately got feedback. And indeed, as a result of a lot of really hard work and intensive, very difficult work between the unions and very passionate BA people, we have reached this agreement in principle, where, just to choose one example of one of the conclusions, the maximum pay impact, including basic pay and the majority of the allowances, is 15%, 1-5. That has been the output of these negotiations that have been taking place over the last few weeks. If you look at the other groups, you will see other types of provisions specific to be that baggage handling or passenger handling, etc. Each one of them are the result, again, of negotiations which finally have happened over the last few weeks.
Well, thank you. And we're aware that for a lot of your classes, some of their pay may be fixed, others may be additional, so therefore what percentage of which, and also there are staff travel allowances. So I'm sure we'll sort of dig in, but the more detail you can give us, the more welcome it is for us. I think we'll start with Gavin Newlands.
Thank you very much, Chair. Good morning, Mr. Cruz. One quick question at the outset. At the outset of this crisis, did you send Section 188 letters to BALPA and the government threatening to fire and rehire pilots in the same fashion that you did for cabin crew to unite, etc.?
No, we did not initially, but we did follow it up a few weeks later with an additional Section 188 as we were negotiating with the pilots, and we told them that this was something that was necessary to make sure that we were equally aligned, and we were consulting over all the different potential possibilities, and the pilots accepted it. It was a difficult, as I mentioned before, very difficult set of negotiations, but very constructive and very productive. To your question, initially no, but a few weeks later, yes.
I think that may be why you had different levels of engagement between the different unions and sections of the business. But Mr Walsh, when he gave evidence to the committee, said that the 12,000 figure would be the maximum number of redundancies that would be required. But given the updates you've given, I haven't heard any specific numbers. How many redundancies are you now planning for in total?
Yes, so if you were to add up all the numbers of the different forms that we filed with the government, the numbers would turn out to be, when you look at all the different work groups of British Airways, just over 13,000 is the number. It was a 12,000, very high 12,000, which ultimately, when we reconcile all the numbers, it was just over 13,000. As of last Friday, we have had approximately 7,200 people leave the business already. That's the amount between July and August. We're still obviously going through the motions in September. And if you were to ask me for an approximate number that we believe at this time may be the end result, the closest number I can give you is probably close to 10,000, closer towards 10,000. But this is a process that remains open. We remain in consultation with a number of areas. We are wanting to continue working with the unions on further measures to mitigate the impact of this pandemic. And these numbers may vary a little bit over the coming weeks. But these are at large the large numbers. I think that it has taken a while, but we have been able to come up with a number of measures which have mitigated this tremendous impact of the pandemic.
Thanks, I appreciate that detail. But you touched on the fact that you didn't want to, or you couldn't really get into decisions of the IAG board and whatnot in terms of remuneration. But how many jobs do you think could have been saved had the bonus to Mr Walsh not been paid, but more importantly, the hundreds of millions of pounds not been spent on a new airline in the middle of a pandemic? How many jobs could have been saved had that money not been spent?
Just to clarify, I'm not aware of IAG buying any airlines or being involved in any financial transactions of any sort, so I don't believe that has happened in any way. But in any case, I think that it's really, really important that I can convey to you the nature of what we're facing. Some of your questions denote a certain optimism, which I really would like to share with regards to the impact of the pandemic. We cannot find much data or information that would support that optimism at this time. In fact, we can find lots of information to support that this is going to be a very, very long recovery process during which we will have some fundamental structural changes to the makeup of our passengers and demand across the globe. That's what we're trying to respond. That's where you will find the British Airways team completely focused on managing at this time.
Okay, thanks. I am aware of the scale of the challenge facing the industry. I'm very much an industry watcher, and I've been urging the government to step in and help and support the industry for some time, and I'll continue to do so. But just to clarify, are you confirming that IAG are no longer interested in buying Air Europa? Is that what you're saying?
No, you made reference, and previous speaker made reference to a transaction having been completed, and it is my understanding that there is no transaction that has been completed. I think that IAG made some announcements last week with their remaining, I believe they still have an interest on this asset, but I believe that no transactions have taken place. Now, just to make it clear, this is not a British Airways transaction. I can probably take you back to a few years back when Iberia was going through a huge restructuring process as a consequence of many years of consecutive losses. And during that time, British Airways, already a sister airline to Iberia, proceeded with the purchase of British Midland. It was a British Airways and British affair, a British transaction. I believe that in this case, it is entirely an Iberia and a Spanish affair. It's taking place by Iberia, if it takes place. But again, it has nothing to do with British Airways. we are completely focused on the future of British Airways.
Okay, thanks. I better move on to the fire and rehire issue, if I may, and going back to my initial question, do you think that the letters, S188 letters threatening the fire and rehire, if you were unable to reach an agreement, were an appropriate starting point for negotiations?
Absolutely, they were, because when the government is extremely clear in their requirement to state outright what is the scope of all the potential topics that would need to be discussed as part of a consultation. And that's precisely what we did. Not only did we make our best estimate in terms of the potential maximum number of redundancies, but also lay out all the different topics which we wanted to sit down with the unions and begin to discuss. And that's precisely what we did. And you mentioned one of them, but many other topics that we have been in consultation with the unions during these 140 days. So we had to be comprehensive. This is by far the biggest impact that this industry has ever gone through. And the degree of uncertainty that this pandemic has brought to our business could only be matched by extremely productive and intensive discussions with the unions, looking for ways to mitigate this impact. So yes, we set out from the very beginning to be as comprehensive as we could and include as many details as we could in order to get to a point like the point that we are on today, where we believe that all these measures and all these agreements will allow us to protect more than 30,000 jobs.
I appreciate the legislation, but still the airline's decision to threaten the firing and rehiring, that didn't have to be done. But regardless of the welcome development, as the Chair has welcomed of the potential agreements with the unions, to my mind, the firing and rehiring is still in effect, and it's already taken place. Many thousands of British Airways employees have left the business. Very difficult decisions have been made. Whether or not there are new contracts or whether or not there are reduced contracts. And you'll see the outcry across the country on fire and rehire. Indeed, you've inspired legislation that I've tabled in the House of Commons to outlaw this practice. But can I ask, was this decision entirely your decision, or was it suggested by your parent company?
Okay, I'm the Chief Exec of British Airways. I'm managing this process. I have an incredible team of over 100 people who have been working through weekends and holidays and personal circumstances with only one objective, a single objective of reaching an agreement with the unions. It has been extremely frustrating at times, but we have persevered. 45 days was the minimum statutory time. Again, day 140 today, and I am pleased to share this news with you. So it is entirely right to say that our intention from the very beginning was to engage in constructive, meaningful, collective consultation with the unions. I'm pleased that we did that with one of the unions, and I'm pleased that we eventually did it with the rest of the unions. And I think that's what matters to the rest of my staff at the moment.
Okay, but just to come back to the point, was Mr. Walsh or anybody at IAG involved in this decision, or was it solely your own?
It was entirely solely the decision of my team and myself. Of course, this is a British Airways affair. It involves British Airways colleagues that have been in the company at times, a really long time. So this is entirely a British Airways decision process and series of decisions, yes, of course.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Cruz. My final question for just now, before I pass on to colleagues, is that essentially the rest of the IAG pilots, crew in Ireland and in Spain, they cannot be threatened with the fire and rehire practice because it is illegal in Spain and Ireland. Do you think that practice should be illegal in the UK as well, or are Spain and Ireland just backwards?
I have seen that different countries across Europe, and I'm ever so slightly more familiar with Ireland and Spain because of our sister airlines. Those legislations have different provisions for the overall management of situations like these, and is different from the UK. We have wanted from the outset to have a set of conversations with the unions, use their expertise, their resources, to come up with conclusions that would help us as a company and our staff to be able to reduce the uncertainty produced by this terrible pandemic. That's what we've been trying to do. And I think that the focus is going to continue working with the unions to try to reduce that uncertainty. The legislation of our country or other countries is something that I cannot influence or change at this time. I must act now. I must take decisions now. I must protect British Airways at all costs at this time.
Okay, thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Gavin. We're going to continue with a number of members on the same point. I think, first of all, Greg Smith.
Thank you very much. Good morning, Mr. Cruz. I'd like to start, if I may, with a particular number of employees, predominantly pilots, who came to British Airways from the Royal Air Force or other armed forces in order to take up careers in civilian life. I raised this with Willie Walsh when he appeared before us earlier in the year and welcomed the concept of the scheme that whilst those pilots had left the military for a reason, having served their country for 5, 10, 15 years, however long it was, the concept of either not having a job or going back to the military, clearly going back to the military was a good thing. However, as part of that deal, it was suggested that they would be on secondment back to the RAF with a clear path back to British Airways once there was a job for them as air travel increased over the next couple of years. I've heard from some pilots part of that scheme that actually not that many have been accepted back to the Royal Air Force, and that of those that have, half of them, it has been suggested to me, have since received compulsory redundancy and therefore don't have that secure route back to British Airways. Can you comment on that scheme, please?
So first, I would say I'm extremely grateful to the RAF for having engaged with our pilot management team and with our pilot community, particularly over the last few months, to try to understand if there was an additional outlet for some of our pilots to join the RAF for a period of time before they return to British Airways. I am aware of that particular program and I fully support it. I think that British Airways has a long history of engagement with the UK Armed Forces and it will continue, absolutely. I'm afraid I'm not fully aware of these specific cases that you are making reference to. However, the overall tone and attitude that British Airways has shown, particularly towards those colleagues that have come from the armed forces, has been of tremendous support. And I absolutely believe that we will continue to look for ways to continue extending that support all along. On this specific case that you're making reference to, I'm afraid I do not know the actual details, but I will be pleased to come back with specific information on them.
Okay, that's very helpful. I accept that you don't have the numbers precisely to hand, but if you could specifically come back to the committee over the next few days with the total number of pilots that have returned to the RAF or indeed any other of the other armed forces, and indeed of those that have returned to the RAF, can we have an exact number, please, of those that are officially seconded and those that have been issued with compulsory redundancy? If we can have that data particularly, I would welcome that, because I'm sure that as a signatory to the military covenant, the Armed Forces Covenant, British Airways would always want to support our veterans that have indeed served their country before, for whatever reasons, family reasons or whatever it might be, deciding they wish to go to a civilian life and work in your company. So that data would be incredibly important. Moving on to more generally redundancies for pilots, can you give an assurance that redundancies for pilots did not follow a last in, first out principle?
I think that the negotiation between the company and the union on this particular topic was quite intense in many respects because of the covenants and the statutes and the own ways of working of the union. And I believe that the final scheme that was decided was a variation. It was not exactly last in, first out a variation. It was a variation that included other provisions as well. So it's not a straightforward answer. I agree with you. It's not a straightforward LIFO. It does have other provisions, and those came in agreement again between the company and the union.
Okay, thank you. Maybe if we can dig into that a little bit more, and if you don't have the data to hand right now, I'd be grateful if you could make it available to the committee afterwards. What was the average age of pilots made redundant?
We are very interested on testing all the different angles associated with people that have stayed and departed or in the process of departing British Airways. And we are in the process of doing an analysis that looks at not just age, but a number of other angles, because we have followed a very strict and consulted selection criteria all across. And we want to make sure that the actual outcome has been completely fair. We believe it has been. This selection criteria has been decided together with the unions. And yes, absolutely, I will be pleased to share the conclusions of those figures as soon as we finalize the process that we currently are in.
Okay, I think it is important that as you do that work, and I'll certainly be very interested to see the data as it comes back from you, the average ages of pilots made redundant, as well as the average age of pilots retained. It has been suggested to me, and I put this to you for comment, it has been suggested to me that actually there is a significant number of pilots that used to fly 747s, which you've taken out of your fleet, that are still being retained on something like 60% pay in a very long queue to be retrained for another aircraft, while relatively young pilots with young families, potentially big debts of mortgages and things, and repaying their pilots' training, have been let go. So I think it would be very interesting to see the breakdowns of how that has all panned out, and perhaps if you haven't got the data right now, a wider commentary from you or broad comment on whether you think that is a reality within the company, or whether some people have suggested something that just isn't accurate.
Yes, I think that the main point, there's two main points here, I think. One is we applied the selection criteria, and the selection criteria that we've been applying throughout this whole process was heavily consulted on. In the case of the pilots, it was nearly designed in conjunction with the union because of the very early engagement with them. So it's an outproduct of a number of trade union representatives from BALPA, the pilots union, as well as from our team. That's an important point. The second point, it is the same point that I shared with you before. There are no easy decisions in this process that we're in. Every single day, I am speaking with colleagues of mine, every single day, face to face, by email, by video conference, by letters. And everyone is facing decisions that we have never wanted to have to face. And within that, there's a lot of many different choices that both the union and ourselves and everybody across the business has had to make. So I understand the difficulty. I will share the data, absolutely, as soon as we finalize the current process that we're in. But I can, again, reassure you that the selection criteria that was used together with the pilots in the process with the pilots was done together between the union and ourselves.
Thank you. I look forward to receiving the data. Back to you, Chairman.
Thank you, Greg. Graham Morris.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good morning, Mr. Cruz. I'd like to ask you some more questions, following on from some of your earlier answers, particularly about the terms and conditions of the new contracts. And one thing I did want to clarify, and I know the Chairman asked initially in your opening remarks, I want to clarify that Unite and the other unions have made it perfectly clear, have they not? They are prepared to accept temporary changes to contracts, reductions in pay, terms and conditions to assist British Airways through this crisis. And that's been negotiated with other airlines. The chairman referred to Ryanair. But the thing that's problematic is that these are permanent changes, permanent structural changes to the contract that are going to go beyond the period of this crisis. Now, Mr. Cruz, can you tell me, are you and your top management team that are working so hard to turn round the fortunes of British Airways, are you subject to permanent changes and reductions in your terms and conditions as are being offered to other staff?
So first I would say that we did not have an opportunity to consider some extremely good suggestions that eventually came to us for more than 73 days. So during this period of time, we were making these suggestions, these proposals, and Unite and the GMB were not responding. They were asking our members to not respond.
Mr. Cruz, you said this earlier, but I must insist, and my colleague Gavin Newlands pointed out, when Section 188 notices are being served, redundancy notices, I don't think we can expect any other response. But in relation to the permanency or temporary nature of these contract changes, that is the issue. We're not. This committee, the loyal workforce, I'm sure you would agree, every good organisation, be it the NHS, be it British Airways, be it a construction company, they rely upon an experienced and a committed and loyal workforce. And our concern as a committee is, by your actions in permanently reducing their terms and conditions, is it necessary? Is that the right course of action? And are you, as an individual and your top team, subject to these same draconian changes?
Okay, so again, I think I'd like to, frankly, I wish I could share this optimism when you make reference to temporary measures. There is no data to support that this is a temporary effect for the airline industry. All the data, all the information that we have, all the prior crises that were significantly smaller than this crisis, all point towards one thing. Things have changed. The airline industry is fundamentally different. And this is what we have set out to do. We set out to consult with the unions on both permanent and temporary measures. And if you look at these agreements that we have reached or reached in principle with the unions, you will see that there is both some permanent measures as well as some temporary measures. And you will also see that there are provisions which within those agreements to get back into the table to analyze what is the position of the airline in the future and how can we get back to absolutely restore some of those pay conditions that were there. That's something that we will have to examine once we actually get to that point. And to your second question, absolutely. There is a negative, structural impact, not just to the airline, the company itself and its employees, but all of its employees are having to make significant changes to the way in which they work and to the way in which they're being remunerated. Please do not lose sight that this is not something that is just going to go away. This pandemic is going to be, the impact of this pandemic is going to be with us for many years. It is my responsibility to make sure that we act now. I want British Airways to be a company that makes it and continues to serve the role that British Airways has been serving over all these years.
Thank you. You didn't answer my question as to whether you personally and your top team were going to be subject to permanent contractual changes, as are the rest of the workforce. But can I ask you something else? Have you actually finished and finalised the new terms and conditions that are going to be offered to the staff who remain? You told the committee a little earlier that almost 13,000 staff would be made redundant. Have those new terms and conditions been finalised?
So to be specifically precise, I said that the combined number of the filings of the HR1 forms amounted to an amount of 13,000, but that we didn't believe that we were going to need to get to that number anymore, thanks to the good work and ideas of most of our staff and the work that we've done with the unions. Where we are, to be precise at this particular moment, is we have already signed agreements with several of the work groups, and we have agreements in principle with at least another 3 groups, which will mean the vast majority of the staff at British Airways. There are some additional smaller groups of people that we will continue to consult or with as their consultation process started later than late April. Okay. We're following the same process across the whole company, but the bulk of British Airways employees are covered by these already signed agreements or agreements in principle, which we hope will be balloted favorably in the next few days, meaning that we will not need to use a contract.
Thanks. I wonder if you might just clarify something, because the committee are given to understand that a number of British Airways employees who have been selected by the company to remain on revised changes to their permanent changes, structural changes to their contract, have been given only until this weekend to decide whether or not to accept new terms and conditions, which have yet to be finalised. Is that correct? And how can anyone reasonably ask employees to accept new contracts when they don't know what the terms and conditions are going to be and the implications for them? And finally, why are you applying pressures, for example, withdrawing the concession for former employees? That seems completely unnecessary to persuade them to sign or take redundancy without any recourse to legal redress.
So just to be correct on the first question, we are in the process of this particular set of ballots, and indeed Saturday the 19th is the closing date. But just to make it clear, this is a process that just didn't start last week. It started months ago, and every single week we have had many video calls, many emails, many documents sent, an extremely informative intranet with information that people can go to 24 hours a day, with copies of agreements, with explanations of agreements. And we have answered tens of thousands of emails on specific questions that our staff have posed to us over the last several months on these proposals that were being made. And I am aware that as these agreements have been coming into place throughout the different groups, more questions have come through and more clarifications have been provided online, on one-to-one briefings, and through multiple communications. So I would say that the amount of information that is available and the amount of channels that are available to our staff are immense. I have to say that I have been answering some of the questions, and it's only rightly so that I do so when I can and when an employee writes to me with their specific story. So there has been a lot of time to be able to consider this. You may know that in some cases we are providing legal advice that we actually pay for. It's independent legal advice as part of different aspects of this process. So we're trying to be extremely supportive during an incredibly difficult time for our staff.
Just to be clear, sorry, Mr. Cruze, just to be clear for the evidence here, because Mr. Morris rightly referred to the deadline of the 19th of September, because in the earlier process, it was a question of choose voluntary redundancy, or by the 19th of September, choose the, what you may call fire and rehire terms. But what you're saying to us is that now the landscape has changed. So therefore, the sort of significant change in terms and conditions to be signed up by the 19th of September is no longer relevant because of this latest development. Is that correct?
It is factually correct for certain groups, and I think it is very probable. I hope that will be exactly as you say it. I hope that the outcome of these ballots will indeed corroborate and confirm the agreements in principle that we have with the unions, which would then mean that there is no need to look at the 19th or any of the contracts that have been issued. Correct.
Yeah, thank you for clearing that up. It's a changing landscape and a welcome one from my perspective, and that's why I want to get this down on the record. Let's continue with Sam Tarry.
Thank you, Chair. Just trying to drill into a couple of specifics which I think it would be important to clear up for the committee. Early on you obviously said that the layoff situation was something that was not happening in any contracts. Would you be able to confirm that's the case for A scales and also in engineering? Because my understanding is that the layoff actually in that section has no restriction, so that means it would default to a legal maximum, which is 6 weeks, which on my calculation, if it was in every 13, which I believe it is, that equates to 24 weeks potentially in a year. And alongside that, just to be really clear around what's happening in mixed fleet, I understand, yes, those negotiations have happened or are happening later, but I think we just need to be clear, because I don't want you to be accused of pulling the wool over the eyes of the committee. My understanding is that for those 4,000 members in mixed fleet, that actually they still do have an unlimited layoff clause in their contract, and that 800 of those staff are still facing the potential of a fire and hire situation if they don't then agree to those new contracts.
Okay, so thank you for allowing me to clarify. Your earlier question did indeed make reference to unpaid leave and layoff clauses and such. So let's go through and make sure that there is no doubts with regards to this. There are different provisions for unpaid leave within the different agreements. And this is in relation to the amount of people that we will need, particularly during the winter season. There was an assessment made earlier in the year, and as soon as we began to engage with the unions, we began to share with them even more information with regards to what we thought was the challenge for our company when we're flying 20%, 25%, 30% maximum of last year, but still having at large a great part of the workforce that we had last year. So the number of unpaid leave weeks varies by the different groups based on agreements reached with those specific branches of the different unions. That is a different topic from the layoff clause. So into the layoff clause. The layoff clause is one that already existed in over 9,000 contracts at British Airways, has existed for many years, and it's never been used during that period of time. We have had a number of crises, but we thought that we needed to do many other things before invoking that clause. So that has been the spirit that has been guiding the usage of that layoff clause. As we moved into a new world, a world of uncertainty, a world of more debt, a world with fewer business passengers, a world that is completely different from the world that we have enjoyed up until 2019. We thought that the right thing to do was first to consult with the unions around many different aspects, but one of these were the layoff clause, to bring them into the same set of contracts that we have with the others. So it is correct, factually correct, that the majority of the agreements that we have agreed in principle with the unions have agreed with us, include a layoff clause. Now, what the unions have been demanding, and I don't disagree with that demand, is that we put in very clear words with regards to that commitment on how those layoff clauses will be used in the future. And in fact, what we've done is put in words that very much reflect the spirit with which those layoff clauses have not been used over the last few years. But we are facing a very uncertain future. There's no way of telling how traffic is going to be evolving over the coming years. And it is the right thing that we all share the same degree of flexibility and that we all work together to make sure that we exhaust every single possibility before we use clauses such as the layoff clause. I hope this clarifies this particular matter.
Thank you, Mr. Cruz. I think that's an interesting opportunity then. I remember when you said that in criticising Unite the Union, that their accusations of fire and rehire were sort of scaremongering, and actually claimed that this is a misinformation campaign. So I welcome what you said today about admitting that that wasn't actually the case, and in fact taking off the table fire and rehire. So would you like to take this opportunity to perhaps retract those comments previously made by yourself?
I've been very careful in the usage of my words because I'm very aware that there's not a single soul that works in this industry that hasn't been affected, and by that I mean everybody. And that includes our union colleagues. The vast majority of our union colleagues are equally passionate British Airways employees that have been representing BA for many years in some cases. And I've been very, very careful with my words. I deeply regret that Unite and the GMB took 73 days to sit down with us. I can only imagine what the output of this whole exercise might have been if we had actually sat down together with the pilot unions from the very beginning. It may have been entirely different. So I am very pleased that we have reached the conclusions that we've reached jointly with them, and I look forward to hearing the results of the ballot over the coming days.
Well, I would argue if perhaps you hadn't held a metaphorical gun to the head in the first place, those negotiations might have happened far more quickly. So just going on something slightly different, I want to think about, you said earlier, and I welcome this, that some of the new contracts are only be temporary, perhaps an opportunity to increase pay and look at other terms and conditions. Because obviously, I'm sure you wouldn't want to be facing years of industrial unrest if the company was back in profit, and therefore, obviously, you'd, I'm sure, be seeking to improve the terms and conditions of staff at that point. So the question I want to ask you is whether you have any idea of the total cost savings from the redundancies and the potential new contracts, because I'm doing some calculations on it, and you may or may not be able to answer this. I've heard evidence it will amount to about only 4% as a saving of the total cost across all of IAG, which I think is a very paltry figure considering the sort of harm that it's done to so many families who are now former BA staff. And what I think needs to be investigated is that if you were to really see the benefit from those changes, those contracts would have to be in place for a very long time. So could you give us an assurance that those contracts are in fact just to deal with the pandemic and the current crisis that we're in, and not a long-term restructuring? Because the thing that occurred to me, and I took time to read this book, and I'm sure some of your staff can send you a copy of it, given it was them that wrote it, that many of the things that you did try to implement are exactly what BA tried to do in 2009 and 2010. And I think we've asked Willie Walsh this question, so I'll ask it to you. Was it not the truth that actually you've implemented a restructuring plan based on long-held views, both of IAG, Willie Walsh and yourself, to actually deliver a change which fundamentally changes the way that staff's term and conditions at BA are on a permanent basis forever?
Mr. Terry, I think it would be crazy for anyone in this industry to admit that they wanted to make the difficult decisions that we're having to make. The position that we're in is impossible. There's absolutely no way, and my track record of just over 4 years at British Airways shows that we would have pursued this degree of structural change at this pace, with this volume of change, if we hadn't had this pandemic. I do not wish any executive or union official anywhere in the world to have to face a situation like this. I think it's very important that I share with you what is likely to happen as we come out of this recovery. We've spoken a lot about the near term. We've spoken about a recovery period. But I have to mention a few events to you, which I know you will remember wholeheartedly. You'll remember the volcano. You'll remember, of course, 9/11 and 2007 crisis, SARS virus. We have had so many shocks to British Airways over the last 20 years, and it's guaranteed that over the next 20 years we're going to have more of those types of shocks. Who knows what will be the source? And BA needs to be prepared to deal with those shocks. The changes that we are proposing at the moment are as a consequence of this huge pandemic and the impact that this pandemic has had. And it will also help us, as we recover from the pandemic, to be able to deal with those aftershocks, which I'm sure there'll be some, maybe pandemic related, maybe related to something else. So the job at hand is huge. It is structural. It is really long term. And that's what we have set out to do. And that's what we need to do. And that's what we needed to do from the onset of this whole process.
Thank you, Mr. Cruz. But just to sort of pin you down on that figure, are the total savings only around the mark of 4% for the total cost across IAG?
So I have no idea what the total costs are of IAG. I'm only focused on British Airways. And it is a fair thing to do, as I said equally to my board, that we do not have the final figures. There are a lot of people who are making individual decisions as we speak. There are a lot of people that are trying to understand what are the best options for themselves. And we, as we go through and continue finalizing discussions with the unions, we hope that there will be further opportunities to mitigate the impact of the pandemic and give us the flexibility to survive and to compete into the future. So I don't think I have that number. Maybe that's a number that we should be sharing with you as soon as we conclude this process, which I hope it will be very soon.
Thank you, Mr. Cruz.
Thank you, Sam. So I think we've largely concluded that section. I'm going to move on to Ruth Cadbury, who may have one point before talking to you about slot allocation. But just before we do, I was really going to ask you what's changed, because from what I'm hearing, it's a welcome change, Mr. Cruz, and hopefully it will be welcomed by your staff at BA in the main as well, notwithstanding their individual issues, as you've specified. And so really I'm sort of keen to know what has changed. And obviously the overriding factor here is that you've talked about the difficulties still in the industry, still the barriers to get people flying, so that bit hasn't changed. And what has changed, obviously, is that Willie Walsh is no longer the Chief Executive of IAG. And I ask this question very much from a corporate governance perspective. Willie Walsh has tried to implement these fire and rehire terms before and failed due to being thwarted by industrial action. So we know that it's very much him as sponsor. We also know from this committee that when we've tried to have anybody else from British Airways or IAG, we end up having to move the slot so that Willie Walsh attended because Willie Walsh had to be the one who attended. So it struck me that he has been running the show. And now he's no longer here. And a week after he's gone, it seems a much more reasonable approach has been put to the table by you and by your Spanish compatriot Luis Gallego. And so my question to you, and perhaps for the staff, is this now a new change of approach, a much more positive reaction towards industrial relations and indeed corporate responsibility, that the staff can look forward to a future? And whilst I know that you won't wish to bury Mr. Walsh in terms of the past, but perhaps it needs a change of one very dominant individual within a big company for matters to move forward to better pastures.
I can't comment a great deal on all the numerous aspects of your question or your comments. I think ultimately I have to revert back to the fact that we are dealing with a situation we've never dealt with before. This is a situation that has required incredibly passionate people at BA to give up hours and days of time with their families and anniversaries, and has reduced the income of everyone at British Airways. That has made all these passionate colleagues of mine deal with uncertainty in a way that we've never dealt with in the past. And despite not having been able to engage with some of the unions at the beginning of the process, I think that it's fair to say that results began to be delivered once that engagement started. And I think that's what we need to be grateful for. Dialogue ultimately leads to results. I'm pleased that that dialogue ensued, and I'm pleased that we've reached a point in which it appears that we may have a solution that does not require the need to issue new contracts. I think that's where we are. We have still a lot of uncertainty in our future, and I think that I'm looking forward to closing down and finalizing, signing every dot of every I of these agreements, and getting back to work with these people that love this industry, love British Airways, are incredibly committed, as I am, to making sure that BA gets back to what it does best, to connect Britain with the world and the world with Britain. That's where our focus is.
Look, I mean, that's very positive. I mean, what I would say, and bear in mind I'm a Conservative MP here, it strikes me that the unions were not willing to engage because of fire and rehire, and you've now taken fire and rehire off the table, so the unions are engaging. That sounds very positive from management and indeed from unions. I'm just pointing out that it's not a coincidence, surely, that Mr. Walsh is no longer in the room. But let's leave it on that positive note. And perhaps let's move over to another subject, slot allocation, and I'll ask Ruth Cadbury to take us forward.
Well, I will move on to slot allocation, but I did want to ask a question before that. I mean, BA is the UK's national airline, national flagship airline, and that in itself accounts for an awful lot of company value. And I accept all of what you've said in terms of the damage to the business and the cost to the business of the coronavirus epidemic. But that is true of all airlines in the UK and across the world, and of IAG. But the response seems to be somewhat different in BA, notwithstanding the welcome removal of fire and rehire on the table. But BA went worse and harder than its parent company, IAG, and the other sister airlines, and also other UK airlines, such as Ryanair, who treated its staff somewhat better. There's the mismatch between the treatment to staff and the CEO's package. And BA still, as you started off today, wants to still is after more taxpayer money, in effect by seeking to pause on air passenger duty. So is not British Airways concerned about its reputation, the damage this does to passenger loyalty, and what is BA going to do to address that damaged reputation?
British Airways is focused on its survival right now. This is the number one focus. As you know, over the last 4 years, I secured the largest ever investment in British Airways, over £6.5 billion for new fuel-efficient airplanes, new seats, new catering, new lounges, etc., which had actually begun to make a huge difference to customer satisfaction and to the reputation of BA. I cannot